I couldn't get this straight, to the point that seriously Dawson tried to physically move my ear. Like, yes, you can move the mic, buddy, but the ear is not going anywhere. So I'm trying not to mess with that too much. In our family, we've kind of had this, I wouldn't really call it a rule, but just something that we say to one another, because the kids would sometimes want to rat each other out, right? So one kid couldn't wait to come and tell me or my husband Robert, do you know what the other kid did? And so we had this little saying that we would use sometimes that was really more a question than it was anything else. Is that really your story to tell? Is that your story to tell? And so I still use this little question in my life and in ministry sometimes when people come and sit down to talk to me about something. I'm like, wait. Or I have in my own life told people that is not my story to tell. When people come to me and say, I want to know what happened with such and such or so and so. I'm like, I can tell you that we're working on that and we're dealing with that, but that is not my story to tell. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about your story to tell. When I preach, I often use my family as sermon illustrations, and they know that. So on Saturdays, they almost cease talking to me because they're sure anything that's said on a Saturday is going to be used in Sunday's sermon. But if it is something that is personal to them, private to them, I do not share those stories unless I ask them. Our daughter has grown up with some immune system issues, and I remember a few years after we got here to San Antonio, and she was just doing so well. And I went to her and asked her, my sermon this Sunday is one where your story of healing and trust would fit so beautifully. May I tell your story this Sunday? And she said, I'm going to get back to you. And she did. When she talked to me, when she got back to me, she said, I think that story might help someone else if they're in the same kind of situation to have a better sense of trust. So you may tell my story. But tonight we're going to talk about what they teach us in Acts is your story to tell and how we can do that. But let's begin by looking at what's going on with Paul and Barnabas and in these crazy pronounced places that I'll probably pronounce a variety of ways. So if you don't think I got it right, just wait, because the next time I say it, I might get it right. What happened in Iconium was much the same. They went into the Jewish synagogue and spoke, with the result that a large crowd, both of Jews and of Greeks, came to faith. Let's stop for just a second there. A large crowd of people, as they're in these synagogues talking, a large crowd of people come to faith. This would be great, wouldn't it, if the story stopped right there? If we could just stop and say, this is what happened in the Jewish synagogues in Iconium, is that Paul and Barnabas went and they spoke, they shared their story, they told. We're going to talk tonight about an apostolic testimony or being apostolic witnesses, and I want to be sure that we know what that's talking about. An apostolic witness, the reason these apostles had to witness the way that they did is because they saw it with their own eyes. They experienced it with their own lives. It was their own hearts that were changed. Right? And so their witness is an apostolic witness because they experienced it themselves. They're not just telling about what somebody else experienced. And so one of the things that we're all called to is that same kind of apostolic witness. How has God changed you? What is God doing in your life? How is the grace of Jesus Christ changing you and forming you? So here's what happens. A lot of people come to the faith, and if the story could stop that right there, it would be a happy ending. But in verse 2, the unbelieving Jews stirred up and poisoned the minds of the Gentiles against the brothers. I think oftentimes when God is doing an amazing work, there is an oppositional force against that still exists in our world today. I know as a person who has been a part of an Emmaus, and then I love to work chrysalis flights. Those are for students, high school students. And God does amazing things on these chrysalis flights. Like takes these kids from wherever it is they are in their faith and just like grows them. It's just amazing to watch and to witness and to see. There is almost every single time before every single chrysalis flight, there are things that just go wrong where you think to yourself, well, maybe we should just throw up our hands and not even do this because everything is going wrong, right? And yet, God does amazing things. So God's doing amazing things, but you see there's opposition to it. There's opposition to the amazing things that God is doing. They stirred up trouble. They poisoned the minds of the Gentiles against the brother. Verse 3, they stayed there a long time speaking boldly on behalf of the Lord, who bore them witness to the word of his grace by giving signs and wonders which were done at their hands. So do you hear that? Like, people are stirring up trouble, and there's problems, and there's opposition, and there's poisoning of minds, and people trying to tell people that it isn't working this way, and yet God still works signs and wonders at the hands of the apostles. I love that. I love that. Sometimes and later in this particular chapter, we'll look at this even more closely, that the apostles, that's what they focus on, is what God is doing. They don't get too caught up and too bogged down by the opposition or the oppositional forces against them. Verse 4, but the inhabitants of the city were divided. Some were with the Jews and some were with the apostles. But then the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers made an attempt to ill-treat them and stone them. Now, in that day and time, I really used to believe that if you got stoned, you always got stoned to death. But that's not actually how that works. Sometimes people were stoned, but not to death. There would be a stoning, but then, before the person died, they would stop and allow that person to live. And so there were stonings that took place. I just always thought that you died when you got stoned, right? This is a situation where they were practicing some of these things, and the people lived through that. Verse 6, they got wind of it, however, and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Laconia, and to the surrounding countryside. There they went on announcing the good news. Man, nothing stops them. Nothing stops them. Now, N.T. Wright talks about something here that really drove home this point to me, because having been in student ministry for so long and still really having a deep love and desire to see students know the grace of Jesus Christ, I've worked with a lot of students who deal with depression and anxiety. And so when they're given medications, sometimes those medications work to get rid of the lows. But like N.T. Wright talks about in the book, so often the students would talk to me and they would be like, I don't want to take this medicine. I'm like, yeah, but the medicine helps with your depression. And they would say, but it doesn't just help with my depression, it makes me not feel anything anymore. Like, I don't feel anything anymore. And so N.T. Wright kind of uses this as an example of how our faith sometimes is. That sometimes we just get into this place where there are no highs and no lows. We just don't feel anything anymore. And our witness is one, and he uses some pretty drastic language about that. He said it's kind of like feeling you're just one of the cows in a herd of cattle. There's not anything different or unusual about you. And so he talks a little bit about what are the highs and the lows. The lows have gone, but so have the highs. And the question he asks is one that I think would be good for us to just talk about a little bit tonight. He says, what is the medication that we've taken which has made us the ecclesiastical equivalent of a herd of cows mooing and mooching to and fro, doing nobody any harm but never getting excited either? And again, that's kind of drastic language. But what is the medication that we have taken that keeps us from being apostolic in our witness, or keeps us from being excited about the good news of Jesus Christ?
I think liturgy runs that risk, where you have that fine, and regardless of what your congregation is, where you have an expectation. I'm going to go, and there's going to be this order of things, and once I get that squared away, I'm fine with the week.
That's a good point. It runs the risk. I like the way you worded that. You didn't say it always does or it definitely does. But liturgy can run the risk of sometimes becoming too rote for us. We've been talking about this in modern worship a lot, about the Lord's Prayer and how beautiful and deep this prayer is, and how one author I was reading said it's a dangerous prayer if you pray it with meaning. But sometimes we recite it without any kind of meaning. We just say it, right? That can be one of the things. One of the things is that we can get caught up into a certain way of doing things that lose their meaning for us. We memorize without meaning, and we recite without reflection, that kind of thing. Good. What else? Anything? Okay. N.T. Wright also talks in this book a little bit about that in our day and time, or in our country, in the world that we live in, the culture that we live in, we're not really very much at the risk of persecution per se. None of us are going to leave here with the fear of being stoned when we walk out the door by people who are in opposition to us, right? So, but there are places where that persecution does take place. He says that nobody is stirring up and poisoning the people's minds against us. Do you agree with that? No, talk to me about that.
The ubiquitous they like to say terrible things about Christians and Christianity.
Okay, so there are people that say terrible things about Christians and about Christianity. Prayers banned in school.
At the airport.
Yeah.
Christian businesses are punished. Christian business owners.
You know, one of the ones I thought about when I was looking at this is there's a new artist kind of on the horizon. She's not terribly new, but pretty new. Lauren Daigle. She has some beautiful music out. She has a song, "I Am Who You Say I Am." It's, so good. And so Lauren has kind of gone outside the walls of what people would just say she should go. And so the point I'm making here is that it comes from non-believers, but it can sometimes come from believers as well. So as an example, she went on the Ellen DeGeneres show, and she spoke of her faith. And Ellen did a fantastic job of interviewing her and respecting her and hearing her views on Christianity. And the Christian community attacked her because she went on or not the whole community. That's terrible to say that. Social media can make it look like everybody's saying it when it was one person. But there were numerous people in the Christian community who kind of went on the attack of her, that she shouldn't have been on that show in the first place, and different kind of things like that. And so what that does in my mind, and what I'm looking at, is I think that's kind of poisoning the minds of the people around you who think, well, if that's how Christians can't even get along with one another, then how is that witness going to have any impact on the rest of the world? That's kind of poisoning the mind. So we have to be careful too about just seeing it from people outside, non-believers, like is in this passage, but because that sometimes happens with believers as well. Comments or thoughts about that?
Yeah. I got a question whether they're believers or not. One of the things that happens, I think, in the Christian community is that those that don't really understand, don't really know, they wear the badge, they don't play the game, really get us in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that as believers, as true believers, we have to be careful about filtering our own propaganda, dare I say, in terms of making sure that it's scripturally based. And the facial ludicrousness of attacking somebody for putting themselves in a place where they can evangelize others for Christ, that's facially an unchristian.
So if you couldn't hear him, what is being said is that the question is, when people do things like this, are they really believers? Because what happens so often, and correct me if I, because a lot of times on Sunday afternoons, I'll look on Facebook and somebody will be like, Lorinda said today, da da da, and there's a quotation marks, and I'm like, never said that. Freaking me out, man. But that, are they really believers? Like if someone is really paying attention to what the Bible says, would they really attack someone who's putting themselves out there to share their Christian faith in a space where they can evangelize? Did I get that? Thank you very much. So we're going to I want to encourage you to think about that a little bit. Are there ways in your own life that you have become pretty complacent and apathetic? And how can your witness become more apostolic in its nature? And we're going to talk about that a little more in depth in a few moments. One of the things that I didn't really think about so much that really enjoyed or appreciated in looking at this is that all throughout, so Paul and Barnabas, the message that they're giving here in Acts 14, it gets the same response that Peter's message got on the day of Pentecost. Very similar response to the message that Peter gave on the day of Pentecost, where lots and lots of people are coming to faith, right? Many people, Jews and Gentiles, are coming to the faith, but many are not. And so here's what Wright points out on page 24 is that throughout all of their lives, the Jewish people have been given these promises, right? These promises of what's going to happen, these promises of a Messiah. Like, this is what's going to happen. God's going to bring salvation to the world through the Israelite people, right? Through the Jewish people. That's what's going to happen. And then when those promises begin to be fulfilled, all the promises, right, that they've been holding on to for generation after generation after generation, those promises are fulfilled through Jesus Christ, and people don't believe it. Like, if all your life you've been told this is what's going to happen, a Messiah is going to come, and he's going to be the Savior of the world. He's going to be the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And you've held on and held on and held on to these promises. And then they're right there and they're being fulfilled in front of you. What kept the people from believing them? That's not a rhetorical question. What kept people from believing? Yes. Okay.
Where in the current world, even in San Antonio, being a Christian or having Christian faith, such as a company like Chick-fil-A, is not politically correct. It's shunned. And so, I mean, I'm not sure what politically correct really is, but there are a lot of people that just are insistent on it. And if you deviate from what they consider to be the norm, you're not being correct.
Okay, so political correctness, are you saying that you think that in that day and time what kept them from believing was their own desire to follow a certain, speaking to your own beliefs, like they had their own belief system in place? And this, good? Yes, thanks Al, yes.
I think part of it too may have been that they were generations and generations and generations of being kept apart and being kept the chosen people, and to suddenly be thrust into a world where they are called to bless others.
Oh yeah.
That's got to be really hard.
Oh, that's good. So she said, all throughout all these generations after generations, they've been a people who've been kind of kept apart. They're the chosen people, and then suddenly they're thrust into this. Okay, you're going to be the people who are the ones who, because God was clear about that. This whole chosen thing doesn't mean like we think of. Like if the next time all of my family is together, if I were to look at one of my children and say, you are the chosen child, the other three would be like, what? But maybe what I'm saying to that child is, you are the chosen one because I have chosen you to mow the lawn. Then nobody wants to be the chosen one, right? That they were chosen for a specific task and a specific mission in this world. I think the way that Wright words it at the top of the page is that it was through Israel that God would bless the whole world. They were chosen for that. So those are good. Those are both very good. What are the other things that you think might be reasons why, after all those years of hearing those promises and now they're being fulfilled, that they couldn't believe it? Alan? Yeah, they were following their own leaders were telling them, right, that this can't be right. So some of their own religious leaders were the ones who were saying, no, yes. Paige. Okay. Really good. They had a whole different set of expectations for what that Messiah was going to look like, right? I know this is live streamed, and so I got to be really careful how I tell this, but this morning in the Bible study, someone in the back of the room said their expectation was that the Messiah was going to come and kick the Egyptians out. But he was in the back of the room, and I thought he said, kick the Egyptians. And so I was like, all right, okay. And then he repeated himself, and I was like, oh, out. You said to kick the Egyptians out. Sorry, live stream, whatever. So yeah, their expectation was that this Messiah was going to come in, right, and he was going to right all the wrongs that had been done to them, and he was going to be this political leader that sat on a worldly, earthly throne and made them be the chosen ones. Is that close to right? Good. Okay. Thanks, everybody. That was very good. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about apostolic witnesses and being out in that wider community. Because Wright talks about, is there a way that we can be more apostolic in our witness? Is there a way that there can be more excitement? And I think about this, think about when you have a story to tell, and it's exciting and it's good news, it's hard. I don't know how it is for you. I'm an extrovert, right? I think we gathered that, right? But even my uber introverted husband, right? Very introverted husband that I have been married to for almost 31 years now. When there's really great news, there are people, he's not like me. He's not going to share it with 5,000 people and even someone who's never met them at Target, right? But he definitely has people that he can't wait to share that with. 2.5 weeks ago, our daughter got married. And we were both like so excited about that. The wedding was so beautiful. It's been actually really hard for me every Sunday morning not to get up and just talk for 20 minutes about my daughter's wedding. Jesus wouldn't be very happy about that, so I don't do that. But when we have something good and something that we want to share, and if we're apostolic about it, like it happened to me, like this is my story to tell. And it's life-changing and it's heart-transforming and everything's different about me as a result of this. I want to share that. And to me, that's Paul. Everything's different about him. Everything's different about his life. And he is irrepressible in his willingness to share this. Like in a few moments, we're going to talk about how they stone him and they think he's dead. We're going to get that in a minute. Irrepressible because he's apostolic in his witness. It's like, this happened to me. This is my story to tell. And this is what I want you to hear, man. Every single one of you have a story to tell. There's no one in this room who doesn't have a story to tell. You have a story to tell. Now, it's not the finished story. I mean, I hope mine's not finished, but I don't know. Tonight could be the night, who knows? But you have a story to tell. And when I think about some of the stuff that we hear about churches out in the community, we need to be telling more about what God is doing within the church and outside the walls of the church and within these communities. Like, you see it with your own eyes, you experience it with your own life, your heart is transformed as a result of it, and you're apostolic witnesses to that. So we're called not to be one cow in a herd of cattle, mooing and mooing. We're called to be people who are excited about and irrepressible in our apostolic witness. What do you think are some of the things that keep us from being apostolic in our witness? Because next we're going to talk about what that looks like. In fact, erase that question. Let's talk about it first and then move into that. How we can be apostolic is he talks a lot about on page 25. And the first one is that he talks about when you share the gospel, you share the whole gospel, right? I've heard people say forever and ever, as long as I can remember, people say things like, well, that's just a watered down version of the gospel. I don't think that what we really do as much, I don't think watering down is what we do as much as we just do partial. I'm just going to tell you part of the story. Like the whole gospel is that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died, that he rose again, that he offers forgiveness and salvation to the world, that proclamation is there for forgiveness. That's the gospel. But sometimes what we want to do is just say, oh, listen, I'm not going to get into all the stuff that Jesus did because it's kind of gruesome and that kind of thing. So let me just tell you that you're forgiven. It's all good. And that's not the whole gospel, right? So one of the ways that we begin by being apostolic in our witness is that we say, as a result of Jesus, the Son of God, who died on my behalf and on the behalf of the sins of the world, so that I could be forgiven, and has changed everything about my life. And here's some of the ways that's happened. The next thing Wright says is that we begin in serious prayer, like that maybe includes some fasting, that we do a kind of prayer that is serious and intentional, and we pray about our witness. Because we know that when we are apostolic in our witness, when we start talking about, I've heard somebody say one time that when you tell your story, nobody can argue with it because it's your story. Well, I wish that were true. But people are going to, well, that probably didn't really happen to you. You just made that up. Or, well, you're the only person that's ever, you know what I'm saying? So people can argue even with your story. But when we know that we're going to come up against some opposition, we know that. We know that there are going to be people, certain power structures in place, thought systems. This past week, Monday and Tuesday, we had clergy convocation here, right here at universities. There are like 11 billion pastors everywhere from all over the conference, you know, all throughout the church. And so they had panels of people who were speaking. And one of those panels, I want to go into everything that was talked about. I just want to tell you this one phrase that I heard that, you know, how every now and then someone's talking and there's just this one phrase that you're like, ooh, I need to think about that phrase more. It was idolatry of certainty. That was the phrase that got used. And I was like, oh, ow, for some reason that stings. And I'm not sure why. I had to leave and go process that some. The idolatry of certainty. Like we're going to come up against people who are so certain of what they believe, and sometimes it might even be us, that we idolize being right. That becomes our idol, being right. Or it's someone else's idol. And so we've got to be in serious prayer about, are we idolizing our certainty? Are we going to come up against the opposition of folks who have idolized their certainty? And prayer is what we need to, a serious prayer is what we need to be practicing. Yes?
You can also have the idolatry of fear, which would keep you from proclaiming your apostolic
Witness, yes.
And I think that fear that would keep you silent, that maybe you have a great story to share, but you fear too much to share. Rejection, or that somebody will question you, or that they'll say it didn't happen.
Yeah. Terry's talking about the idolatry of fear, where just that whole fear of rejection or opposition or, even sometimes being mocked, that kind of thing, can come into place. And that is another place where that serious prayer, when we're practicing it, when that becomes a part of who we are and what we do, can really help. Doesn't always take it away, but it gives us a courage that we wouldn't necessarily have. There have been some times in my own life where I've been really clear that, and let me say this, I've never heard the audible voice of God speak to me, and I will have the same reaction to that as everyone in the Bible ever had when an angel appeared. I'll be scared to death, right? But I have definitely had God speak into my spirit where I knew that God was directing me to do something. And the sense of peace and joy when I'm faithful to that is immeasurable. And the lack of peace and joy when I'm not faithful to it, equally immeasurable. I mean, there have been times when I knew that I was supposed to speak something to someone and I just didn't do it. I just didn't have the courage to do it. And there have been times when I have, when it was just so clear. My mom is a cancer survivor, and my daughter and I were in a Luby's one day, and there was a woman sitting all alone at a table, and she had her scarf on, and it was real close to the medical center. And so my assumption was that she'd probably been to another chemo treatment, and she was sitting there alone. And our daughter was young at the time, maybe 8th grade. And I said, Anna, I just have the strongest feeling that we should go sit with that lady, or at least invite ourselves to her table. And she's like, okay. And our daughter's also an introvert, so her neck turned red, and she said, okay. And so we went and we had a conversation with this lady at the Luby's in College Station, Texas, in Bryan College Station. And she talked about her cancer and her fear. And I was able to tell her that my mother had the exact same kind of cancer that she had, and that she was a survivor, and that things were hard, but they were worth it. And I just don't think that was me. That was God saying, you've got a story that you can tell of trusting in Jesus, of trusting in your church to pray for you, different things like that. So the reward in that, we don't do it for that, but it's certainly there when we're faithful to that. And we can't do that without prayer. So also want to point out the whole synagogue situation, because they're talking about all this taking place at the synagogue. The synagogue was not just a place where people went to worship. So when I was reading about this and being reminded of what that looked like with all the civic structures in place around the synagogue, I remembered being in Italy. And so often in some of the towns in Italy where the church was, there was this huge square, right? And all kinds of other things were taking place there. Transportation and police officers and, police stations, and so much was happening inside that, in that synagogue area. And so what Paul and Barnabas are, I think, we're trying to be taught chapter 14 is that this is supposed to be a part of our everyday lives. It's supposed to be like what we say is actually how we live. And one of the things he talks about is that you won't have that same kind of effect in your witness if you're not living it. Like, you need to be able to say it and where people will believe it because this is how you live. That we are all called to this ministry in some way or another that impacts and affects the way we work, the way we teach, the way we learn, the way we interact with our families and our marriages, our parenting, our everything, right? One of the joys I had of serving at A&M Methodist was that I had the blessing of knowing a lot of students. And oftentimes kind of the ones who were what you might call the cream of the crop, so to speak. I mean, these were kids who were like trying so hard to live like Jesus, right? And I would get to meet them and kind of do life with them and that sort of thing. So frequently they would be in my office to talk to me about calling on their lives, what they were called to do. And so as a pastor, it's always fun to be like, oh yeah, I can see that call to ministry on your life. But I remember a young man, his name is Jason. And Jason was serving in our student ministry. And he came into my office one day and he was talking to me. He's like, I'm so confused right now. I just don't know what to do. All my life, I have dreamed of being a high school football coach. I have always wanted and desired to coach high school football. But now, after serving in student ministry, I just really believe God is calling me to be in ministry to students. And so I was like, how is that? Talk to me about the confusion here. He's like, well, do I become a high school football coach or do I become a minister? And I said, yes. He's a high school football coach. And students that get to meet Jason and have Jason speak truth into their lives are changed as a result of his ministry to students as a high school football coach. I hope you get where I'm going here. Oh yeah, thank you, Connie. That no matter what you are, what your profession, whether you are a stay-at-home mom or whether you are traveling to and fro in your business, right? You are called to be in ministry and to be an apostolic witness in the world. That's what we're called to do, and we need to be able to live it in a way that when we say it, it's believed because people can see it in the way that we live. Let's move on to the next verses here. I want to make sure I didn't leave anything out. Oh yeah, there we go. I didn't, I don't think. Acts 14, verses 8 through 20, confusion. There was a man sitting in Lystra who was unable to use his feet. He had been lame from his mother's womb, never walked. He heard Paul speaking. When Paul looked hard at him and saw that he had faith to be made well, he said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." I don't know why, but for some reason, I just imagine Paul always speaking in a loud voice. Just seems that way to me. Up he jumped and he walked about. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted loudly in the Laconian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." They called Barnabas Zeus and Paul, because he was the main speaker, Hermes. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garland to the city gates. There was a crowd with him, and he was all ready to offer sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. But when the apostles Paul and Barnabas heard of it, they tore their clothes and rushed into the crowd. What does it mean in the Jewish culture when you tear your clothes? Like, yes, anguish, like deep grief. No. I mean, they're having a very strong reaction to the people making them gods in human form, all right? They tore their clothes and they rushed into the crowd. Men, they shouted, "What on earth are you doing? We're just ordinary humans with the same nature as you, and we are bringing you the wonderful message that you should turn away from those foolish things to the living God, the one who made heaven and earth and the sea and everything in them." He's telling them, like, what we're trying to do right here is tell you to turn away from these foolish gods that you're worshiping and return to the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth and all that exists. Return your worship to that God. It's like they're turning Paul and Barnabas into exactly what Paul and Barnabas are trying to debunk, what Paul and Barnabas are trying to say, this shouldn't even exist in your world. And they're trying to turn them into it. Verse 16. In earlier generations, he allowed all the nations to go their own ways, but even then he didn't leave himself without witness. He has done you good, giving you rain from heaven and times of fruitfulness, filling your bodies with food and your hearts with gladness. Even by saying this, they only restrained the crowds from offering them sacrifice. But some Jews arrived from Antioch and Iconium and persuaded the crowds to stone Paul. They dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. The disciples gathered around him, however, and he got up and went into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas went off to Derbe. So, here again we see this irrepressible nature of Paul, right? And Barnabas as well as the disciples. He's trying to explain to them that the gods that they are worshiping are not gods. They are false gods. And then they make him and Barnabas one, they try to make he and Barnabas one of those false gods. So, I love what Wright points out in this. It is remarkable what can happen to a message when the hearers insist on inserting it firmly into their own worldview. Ouch. It's amazing, isn't it? It is remarkable what can happen to a message when the hearers insist on inserting it firmly into their own world views. Where have you experienced this yourself or seen it happen? Where the message gets, and please don't use any names. My husband. Where have you seen this happen? Where the message gets twisted because someone's inserted their own worldview in it. Yes, I'm sorry. There's a light there, so I can hardly see you. You got to go like that.
Sure, halo.
Yeah, that's what it is.
I think there are a million examples of that, and I think there are a lot of them in this present world we live in, where someone will throw out a random verse of scripture.
Oh, sure.
Intended to support X, Y, Z. That is their worldview.
Yes.
Or maybe even it's not actually a verse of scripture. Like God helps those who help themselves.
Second Assumptions. We just did that sermon series. Yes, right.
So I think there are lots of examples.
Yeah, that's excellent. She's saying that one of the ways that this happens is when people take just a portion of scripture, right, and pull that out of its context and use it to promote X, Y, or Z. And not paying attention to the context with where it came from, that it came from. So a lot of you know that that our son recently experienced an accident where he sustained second and third degree burns on his body and had to have 2 surgeries the week after the wedding, and just got out of the hospital this past week. And so when we're in the hospital one night and we have the television on, burns are very painful. I'm sure you already know that. So any kind of distraction for him was somewhat helpful. And so we're watching television and they're interviewing Willie Nelson. And Willie Nelson says in this interview, "I've learned that God will never give you more than you can handle." And so our son, who knows me really well, is like, "I know, Mom, I know." I'm like, "No, I'm going to say it anyway." It does not say that in the Bible. It says that God is never going to allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear as long as you rely on the power and presence of His Holy Spirit. You're not going to be tempted beyond what you can bear, right? And so it's kind of taking that scripture out of its context, right? And so, Justin was right away, I know. Don't do the sermon. But yeah. And the other thing, sometimes what I see is, especially, I'm less and less on social media than I used to be. I used to really be into it. And now I'm not quite as much because there's some frustration for me in it. But when you watch sometimes what the people post that are news articles and things like that, it's almost always to promote what they already believe is true. So I'm always talking to one of my parents and saying, you could watch other news sources too. You don't have to just watch that one news source. What if you watched a lot of news sources? And what if you watched with the filter that news is to entertain you and rile you up sometimes? And I learned some years ago in College Station when Bonfire fell, and so I was unfortunately in the news quite a bit, that you get very misquoted, and that it's better just not sometimes to say anything at all. But then when you don't say anything at all, they fill in the blanks for you sometimes. And so that's not every media source. Some media sources are excellent. They work very, very hard at getting the story as accurate as they can possibly get it, but not all of them do. And so it's important for us to stop and think for a moment, am I believing this because it already supports what I already believe? Or do I need to look at possibly a different, am I idolizing what I already believe to be true, right? And so then what's going to happen then is that message is going to get turned around, and it happens in Scripture. It happens for pastors as well. Like I say sometimes in a sermon, like, I'm getting ready to say something, and if you leave and say that I said this other thing, this is being recorded. So don't leave here and say, I said, because the message can get twisted when people already have decided what they believe, and there can be no other way to believe it. And there can be no other way to see it. This message that Paul and Barnabas are speaking to the people in the synagogue flies in the face of what they already believe. And so for some of them, it's like good news. And for others of them, it's like, no, I'm already sold out. This is what I believe. This is my news source. And I'm not going to hear anything you have to say, right? There's another place where he says this and talks about how uncomfortable it can be for us when we have to stop and think about things a little differently than we normally have, or in a new way. So because it flies in the face of their traditions, and Robert and I went last week to Majestic Theater to see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? That is not what we saw. Why did I say that? I need sleep. Fiddler on the Roof. Not anything the same. That might have been a Freudian slip for me today, right? Okay, so we saw Fiddler on the Roof, and I love that very first song in Fiddler on the Roof, because one thing I really like stomping when people sing. I don't know why, I just like that sound of stomping, and they stomp a lot. Tradition. And then you watch this whole family and how things, this way of believing that just cannot be changed, even if it means I say to someone that I love with all my heart, I turn my back on you. All for the sake of tradition. And so when they're speaking, when the message that they're saying flies in the face of that tradition and what they've always believed, the result of that is violence. Like, people can become violent, and the people there did. I mean, they stoned Paul, but not to death, to the point where they thought he was dead. On page 31, N.T. Wright says this: one of the things that this passage highlights is the almost bottomless pit of potential misunderstandings that await anyone who tries to speak and live out the essentially Jewish message of the gospel with its remarkable news of the one true Creator God. There are going to be misunderstandings. There are going to be people who do not want to hear what you have to say. But it's your apostolic witness. Let's go on to go through 21. Okay. Okay.
If you go to somebody and you say, God spoke to me, their worldview 99% of the time is going to be, that's too otherworldly. He wouldn't speak to me. But Ezekiel had a great experience where God whispered to him. And I think so often we reject the voice of God. It's not because we don't hear it, it's because we can't accept it because our worldview is too small.
Oh, absolutely.
Finite. And we have an exquisite sense of our own unworthiness. And God just doesn't care much about that because he gets to define our worthiness. Explain that to somebody and you're going to have a clash of worldviews.
Sure. Yeah, that and a lot of other things. I mean, he says it's a bottomless pit of the things that people can misunderstand. So what Tom was saying,
I love the
Do you know have you noticed how much briefer I make it? No, I'm just kidding. No, I love to hear from you. I love to hear from you. Is that sometimes it's hard for people when we say things like, God spoke to me and said that to them, that's an otherworldly, God couldn't speak to them. Ezekiel, God whispers to, and there's this whole event that takes place. So how do we go about speaking in that kind of language that speaks to what God is doing in our lives, that doesn't come across as so otherworldly? He also talked about that we have an exquisite sense of our own unworthiness, and we really need to move kind of out of that place and trust God to be the one who defines our worthiness. That's what Lauren Daigle talks about a lot in the song, I Am Who You Say I Am. Because we tell ourselves, I can remind myself on the daily, how messed up and broken I am. But God's words to me are, but you are worthy. You are worthy. And so, did I get that right? Okay. I was hoping you were going to say, no, you're not actually worthy. Oh, you're being brief. I'm sorry I missed that. All right, let's go to verses 21 through 28, opening the door of faith. They preached in Derbe and made many disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the hearts of the disciples and urging them to remain in the faith. They warned them that getting into God's kingdom would mean going through considerable suffering. In every church, they appointed elders by laying hands on them. They fasted, they prayed, and commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. I want to stop there for just a minute and talk about that. All those things that have just happened, all the things that have either just happened to them personally and physically, or that they've witnessed happening to one another. And this is what they do together. It just really struck me this week as I looked at this, and I wondered if any one of us, I know some of you really well and have a deep love for you. If I were to see any one of you stoned almost to death, I'm not sure that I would want us to gather together. I'm not sure that I would gather us together for this, but this is what they do. They gather the church together, strengthening the hearts, urging them to remain in faith. They warned them that getting into God's kingdom would mean going through considerable suffering, and they appointed people. They laid hands on them, they prayed for them, and they sent them. And laying hands on people wasn't to control them, but to release control and let them go out into the world and do what God had called them and designed them to do. They went through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia, and when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. From there they sailed to Antioch, which was where they had commended to God's grace for the work which they had accomplished. Once there, they called the church together. Do you hear that? Once there, they called the church together and told them all the things which God had done with them and how he'd opened a door of faith for the Gentiles. They stayed there a long time with the disciples. They gathered the church together and they told them all the things that God was doing and that all the things that God had done. They used their apostolic witness to say, many people have come to the faith as a result of our witness in the world. I hope that you see the beauty in that, the selflessness in that, gathering the church together to be reminded that there will be suffering, but we can be strengthened in God, and God is going to do amazing work in and through us. It's not about controlling one another. It's not about having a control over people. It's about laying hands and praying. I know, for those of us who have been in the clergy role, or several of us here that are in the clergy role, there's a time when you kneel at an altar and people lay their hands on you and they pray for you, and they either commission or they license or they ordain you for ministry, and then they send you forth. And I have wished many times that I could go up to that altar every year at annual conference and have clergy lay hands on me and pray that I'll continue to be strengthened for the ministry, And that be reminded that there's going to be suffering, but that God is at work. There's something very beautiful in what Paul and Barnabas did in this moment when they laid hands on one another and they commended one another for the ministry. And they said, go out and be apostolic in your witness, giving them the strength to do that again and again and again.
It seems to me that wouldn't be a bad way to run a family.
Oh yeah, that wouldn't be a bad way to run a family.
Parents their children that way is to empower them and to remind them of the great things that God has done, because that's an immediate thing that they can see,
Sure.
and then send them out to be ministers in their own community.
Because I think our kid, he's talking about this is a good way to run a family, that as parents that you remind your kids of the good that they're seeing God do, because they can see that with their own eyes. And then pray for them to have the strength as they leave that house and go out into the world. Because I think our kids are faced with things that I wasn't necessarily faced with as a kid. Granted, there are some things that I was faced with that they're not today. So I guess it's a give and take kind of deal. But our kids, I remember reading a long time ago when our kids were little to not only to pray with your children, but to let your children overhear you praying for them. Let them hear you as you pray those prayers for them. So yeah, I think that's a great way. Not just a family, but if you can, even a business, right? Great way to run a church for sure. So the people are commended to the grace of God. Wright talks about this on page 34, that he rejoiced when Barnabas went to Antioch in chapter 11. He rejoiced because he saw the grace of God. In other words, he saw that God was powerfully working in the people and teaching people, not because of their credentials, not because of their education, not because of who their parents were or their ancestry, but because the grace of God was poured out upon them. The grace of God was poured out upon them. Every now and then, I'll get an email, not very often, it doesn't happen very often, especially it doesn't happen that often here, but I've gotten emails in the past where the first thing someone will do is list off all their credentials. And I don't know if that's to build credibility in the complaint that's about to take place or what that's for, but I will tell you this, Evelyn would speed read that stuff. Like zip down, and then let's get to the meat of this, right? I wonder if sometimes we look so hard at people's qualifications, their social or cultural status, their race or their ancestry or their moral achievement, that we miss the grace of God on their lives. And in 11:23, this is what Barnabas is rejoicing over, the grace of God, continuing a life of trusting the generosity of God. People were commended, now catch this, to the grace of God. Commended to the grace of God. That's ministry. Grace isn't just a doctrine to be believed. It's a fact that you can lean your weight on. And that's what ministry is about. That's what the ministry of planting churches and commissioning pastors, ordaining new leaders, new ministers. In turn, that's what all that is about, the grace of God. I wonder if you've seen that. How have you seen that, specifically at university? How have you seen people commended for the grace of God, by the grace of God? Or you yourself, perhaps? Yes, Paige. Pardon? Foster care ministry in our church. People who don't necessarily have the credentials or the training or any of that for that ministry are just stepping in, and it's been a beautiful ministry. It's been a beautiful ministry. Our ring bearers were kids that we got to go to their adoption. So great. That's one way. Anybody else? Walk to Emmaus. Yes? Oh, the reunion groups that take place, yes. Stephen ministers. Very good. Praying for one another. Absolutely. The leadership of the church. Thanks. Well, I'll tell you, I've been in ministry a number of years, and take an opportunity to say to this group that there are two things right now that are just bringing tremendous joy and peace in my heart. And one of them is the leadership I get to work with, like on the daily. The pastors that I get to be in ministry with, those that are here, those that are retired, and we get to be in ministry with, it's just absolutely beautiful. And the second thing that brings a lot of joy and peace to my heart is the way that I've seen this church respond, knowing that there's been controversy within the United Methodist Church, and yet people's hearts break for people whose hearts are broken. Instead of feeling victorious or, In fact, it was mentioned in the convocation this past week that the bishop knew of one church where the leadership made phone calls or visits with every person they knew were wounded and brokenhearted by the results of a vote. And that kind of leads us to the last part of the thing that N.T. Wright talks about. The worrying thing, he says, of course, is this, that when Paul and Barnabas laid hands on the newly appointed elders and then left them to it, that didn't mean that they were automatically safe. Indeed, it probably meant that there were new times of testing that would be burst upon them, and that's often how it works. But Paul meant what he said in verse 22, it is through much suffering that we shall enter God's kingdom. And in this last sentence, he says, and sometimes the suffering comes in the form of terrible church-dividing controversy. And I underlined that sentence because I realized that there have been things that have happened here, specifically, at university and within the United Methodist Church, that could have been terrible church-dividing issues or results or problems. And yet there's this sense, I believe, of the leadership as well as the church body, majority speaking. I can't speak for every single person, but the people I talk to and the people that I'm in relationship with say there is work for the church to do. There's healing of hearts that needs to take place. There's a mission of the church to talk about the full meaning of the gospel, the full gospel that Jesus is the Son of God, died, rose again, for the salvation, the forgiveness of sins that needs to be proclaimed outside of the walls of this church. And I see that. I see this church as a church that still sees that we may be sitting on a pew with someone that we see things the exact opposite from that person. On any given Sunday, if you fill up the pews of this church or the rows of chairs on the north side of the campus, and you look at the people sitting next to each other in church, you're going to have a wide variety of viewpoints and belief systems in place. And yet we hold on to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that brings unity to the body that doesn't always see things the same way, that may disagree fervently. There's still unity. I mentioned earlier that my husband and I have been married for almost 31 years. Almost 31 years. And we dated for several years before we got married. Boy, wouldn't it be great if I could look at you and tell you, we have always seen everything from the exact same point of view. I want to suggest to you that I don't think that would be all that great, honestly. I think it brings growth to us when we see things differently. When him being an introvert and me being an extrovert, we went to a wedding this past Saturday that we weren't in charge of. It was awesome because we didn't have to plan anything. But anytime we leave a social event, the differences between us, that's when they show up stronger than any other time. Because when Robert Kwiatkowski is ready to leave, he's gone. He just disappears. When I'm ready to leave a social event, I have at least 150 people I need to say goodbye to. And I need to probably have a little bit of a conversation with each one of them as I say goodbye. When we were at Wesley Taylor's wedding, probably 6 years ago, I knew almost every single person at that wedding. And so Robert Kwiatkowski came to me and he said, Lorinda, we still have to drive back to San Antonio tonight. You're preaching in the morning. It's time for us to go. And I said, okay. I just have a couple of people to say goodbye to first. And my husband said, and so the dance begins. We don't see things the same way, but there is a unity in our marriage, right? There's a unity. And I see the same thing here at university. There is a unity that exists here among people who do not see things the same way. You can take it as simple as when we worship together, when we have all church worship, and people who are traditional worshipers at their very core